So my wife, so a couple of things, Andy, before I talk about my wife, because again, lots of people would like to. Thanks. I was so excited you all are here. And Andy and I, when we were talking about this along with Michelle, when we talked about what we wanted the time to look like, I'm going to be there in March doing the whole keynote thing. And, you know, if there's one benefit that we have through this medium right here is that we can make it a conversation. So hoping to hear from all of you. Would love to hear sort of like whatever questions, comments, concerns, heart palpitations you have about what's going on around the country relative to blended and online learning. Would love to talk with all of you. So yeah, in terms of Breaking Bold, yes, I authored Breaking Bold with my wife, which if any of you are interested in testing the boundaries of your marriage, I'd strongly recommend authoring a book with your spouse. It's a really, really great way to test the strength of a relationship. It will be probably the first and last book that Molly and I write together. We do the podcast together, that's enough. But yeah, her teaching experience, she learned how to be a teacher, cut her teeth as a classroom teacher, teaching middle school in East Los Angeles. That's where she learned how to be a teacher. And so the wealth of experience that she brings to the table, teaching kids in difficult learning environments was huge. And we have so many conversations related to education and building relationships with kids that it was a supernatural fit that she would help author that book with me. Given that, you know, I had already put so much down and put pen to paper in Bold School, I was curious to have her perspective as well.
Yeah. And then you obviously have a different perspective because you spent most of your experience or all of your experience teaching in a high school setting, right?
Yes. So all of my teaching experience comes in a high school setting. All of my administrative experience comes in middle and elementary school. So that gives me a nice sort of wealth of perspective. But yeah, my core classroom teaching experience, I was a high school teacher for nearly 15 years. And that's where my experience comes from. And I wanted the experience of someone like Molly, who has taught in East Los Angeles. She's taught in twice exceptional middle schools here in the state of Colorado. And so that's just, as we all know, that's experience I don't have, and experience you don't have. We have to lean so heavily into each other. And I've got this person in my house who has this experience. And so so much of my work in education has just been about elevating educators' voices so that they can be amplified and heard, because there's so many lessons and so many things that we all share. Like I said, Molly's voice was a voice I definitely wanted to amplify.
You know, one of the things that, Weston, that I loved in Bold School was you talked about your pre-service experience. And it's something that we have a lot of conversations about in Ohio because state testing is really big here, just like it is everywhere else. And, you know, I'm super blessed at Amherst Junior High. We have a lot of great teachers who have a lot of wisdom to share, you know, but that pre-service experience is so important. And you talk about it at the beginning of Bold School. But when you go out and you talk to different schools and you talk to teachers, how do you kind of get that across or deliver that message that, hey, I know you're judged by these tests, but in reality, that pre-service experience is going to give us more teachers that are better in the classroom, which is better for kids. Like, do you ever have those conversations? Do people ever come to you and talk to you about how, hey, I don't want to have a college student in my classroom for 12 weeks because that might hurt my scores. And, you know, that hurts the way people view me.
It's a conversation I have all the time with practitioners, with educators who are in the classrooms and talking about having student teachers at their side. And it's a conversation I'm having at universities a lot. And so hear me when I say this and hear it with as best of intention as possible. I believe right now, like, our post-secondary institutions are doing a remarkably poor job of preparing classroom teachers for what classrooms authentically are. It is bananas to me that we graduate so many teachers and put them into the classrooms, and they can tell you about, you know, Pavlov's dog and the salivation experiment. Like, I'll bring you all back to like your first year psych course right now, right? They can tell you about Pavlov's dog, but they don't know how to do a reciprocal teach, or they don't know how to do a jigsaw activity, or that a jigsaw has an effect size of 1.2, or reciprocal teach means getting kids to predict, clarify, question, and summarize. Like, they have no idea about any of that, but they have all of this sort of like pseudo hypothetical knowledge that offers them almost no value in the classroom. And so like that pre-service experience is important. It's the place where you initially get the opportunity to cut your teeth and learn from a person who's actually in a classroom doing the work. Too many of our college professors have not been in classrooms either ever or in decades, and that's problematic. That's problematic. We need to make sure that our teachers have the opportunity, because I'm a firm believer, not a single one of us, not one, gets out of this profession alive without the benefit of some really great coaching and mentorship. I write about Kirk Datto in the book. I'll talk about him during the keynote a little bit. And I'm a firm believer, every single one of us needs that person, regardless of where we are in our careers. And that starts at the pre-service experience. And so we have to, to my earlier point, like be willing to amplify our own voices and help other people amplify their voices so that mentorship and relationship building can take hold, because it's essential. Because right now, the quality of what we're putting out, to no fault of those early teachers, to no fault of their own, is of relatively poor quality, and they're just not getting the things they need to be successful.
Right. And you mentioned John Hattie, and it always surprises me, and I'm sure you experience this too. How many people have still not heard of John Hattie's work? How many people really don't even, we get to that point sometimes where we get in a rut and we can't find the time to explore new things, or we're in districts where our principals are trying to lead top down instead of lead from the classroom with what the teachers need, and really just be more of a support, because that's really what we need from our administrators now. We need instructional support. And so how do we expose more teachers to that? I mean, outside of the college, like how do we do that in our buildings, exposing more teachers to John Hattie and his work, or even Marzano and those guys?
Yeah, so challenge number one that we have is making that work approachable. So John Hattie, that I'm a huge John Hattie fan, but John Hattie is also not an educator, right? He's not a teacher, he's a statistician. And so if you pick up a copy of Visible Learning, if you are not a statistician, like it is dense. If you are a high school social studies teacher like myself, like it's very difficult to just sort of at a glance wrap your mind around and then make useful. That's a huge, huge challenge. Not to mention, we have to acknowledge the reality that teachers are facing right now. And so, yeah, it does. Andy, to your point, it blows my mind that there's so many teachers out there who have not heard of John Hattie's work. But I'll tell you what, like think about what 2020 has looked like, and imagine you're drowning and then somebody hands you John Hattie's book. That's what teachers are facing right now. It's like all they're trying to do is tread water and keep their head above water. We can't just hand them John Hattie's work and be like, hey, you should read this book. It's awesome. Like they don't have time for that. Like let's sort of, and it's what I've tried to do, and it's what I try to do every time I travel around, is like, okay, let's take John Hattie's work, let's distill it. What part of this work is useful for us? And then how do we put it into our practice tomorrow? Not hypothetically, but how do we take John Hattie's work, develop an understanding that, okay, problem solving teaching has an effect size of greater than 6/10, understand what that means, and then understand the methodology behind problem solving teaching so it can show up for kids. Like that's a thing that we need to be able to do really succinctly in the professional development work that we do with teachers. But too often we don't take it that far. We take a work like John Hattie and Visible Learning and we lay it at a teacher's feet and say like, hey, this is awesome, sort it out. And that's just never going to be a working methodology for great professional development. They need more support than that.
Yeah, and you know what? I think Bold School does a really good job of doing that, because it sounds like to you, was a high school social studies teacher in my third year, and my curriculum director was like, hey, you might really like this book, and he hands me Visible Learning, and I'm just flipping through it, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm trying to teach the enlightenment to kids and make them think that, this matters, and now you're talking to me about this, the research and where did you do it and the effect, what is effect size? How does that work? And none of this stuff had I learned in college. Like you said, going back to your first point of the training that we had in post-secondary, it doesn't make sense. So, in your coaching experience, how do you present that in a not overwhelming way? Do you, besides just giving them Bold School, do you present it to them in like, hey, after I observe your classroom, here's one or two strategies that you're kind of using that might be really effective for you? Or, how do you kind of present that to teachers in a way that we could do it as teacher leaders or as administrators in Ohio to kind of open that door for teachers, maybe not this year in the middle of the pandemic, but moving forward?
Yeah, so the first thing you have to do, Andy, is expose that there's a problem to begin with. So everyone do me a favor, get your typing fingers ready. in the chat. I want to hear from you real quick. I did some research. I wanted to know, on average, how many instructional strategies do you think your average teacher nationwide can both name, and here's the kicker, describe with accuracy? Enter your number into the chat. What do you think it is? How many instructional strategies do you think your average classroom teacher nationwide can both name and describe with accuracy? Yeah, I see 3, I see 4, I see 2, I see 5. The answer is 3. Okay, so the answer is 3. Your average classroom teacher is working from a list of instructional strategies that is only 3 strategies long, where they can both name the strategy and describe it with accuracy. Now, how many digital tools? In the same research, I wanted to know, how many digital tools do you think your average teacher can name and describe with accuracy? How many Kahoots? How many Google Classrooms? You think that number was higher or lower than 3? Yeah, Andy says 30. Yeah, right? So like that number, it's 6. Your average classroom teacher nationwide is working from a list of strategies that is double or that is less than half of the list of digital tools that they're working with. And so step number 1, like we have to expose that there's a problem, there's a deficiency. We have to understand that our children cannot succeed. They cannot succeed in classrooms where there is a tool surplus and a strategies deficit. They just can't. And then that's our intro point into John Hattie's work. Okay, so what does that mean then? Well, let's take a look at John Hattie's work. Let's take a look at effect sizes. When you take a look at the effect size, let's understand what an effect size means. And when you take a look at technology on its own in our schools and classrooms around the country, the level of effectiveness of just technology on its own is very, very low. But when you take a look at highly effective instructional strategies, when you look at self-assessment and discover it has an effect size of 1.44, when you see that feedback has an effect size of 0.73, explicit direct instruction has an effect size of 0.59, when you look at these things and you see it's instructional strategies that move the needle for teachers, like then that's the entry point, right? Then it's like, oh, okay, instructional strategies are where we're going to be able to meet those learning outcomes so that we can show out on those tests that they make our kids take every year. So now what does that mean? Now do I have to sort through all of John Hattie's 256 influences and decide what's applicable for me? No, that's my job, right? That's why I wrote Bold School, because no, like teachers don't have time for that. Quite frankly, principals, superintendents, assistant supes don't have time for that. That's my job. My job is to take a look at John Hattie's work, distill those 256 and say, here are the top 11 most frequently used high yield strategies being used by master teachers around the country and around the world. Now, let's wrap our head around these 11, and not even these 11 all at once. Let's take 3, 4, 5 of these, add these to our repertoire, and that's how we build proficiency over time, right? It's not about taking a look at John Hattie's work in the macro. It's about taking a look at that work in the micro, distilling it and making it usable. We have to do that, because especially in the place of blended learning right now, Andy, right? Because I'll tell you, when I'm just talking to school and district leaders out there, I like to tell them all the time, like, let me take a teacher's brain, open it up and let you look inside. And I say, you know what the biggest fear that teachers have around the arrival of technology? It's that the arrival of technology represents the departure of everything they love about teaching and learning. That's the fear. That's the fear. And it's a justifiable fear, because we were sold this bill of goods that was like, hey, technology is going to be the end all be all. It's going to be the thing that cures everything that ails us in education. That's just not true. Technology is a magnifier. It will magnify and amplify what already exists in the classroom. And if what already exists in the classroom is not pedagogically sound, then guess what? Technology is going to amplify that. It's going to magnify that. And I think that's what we've seen during global pandemic, is that technology and its arrival and its presence front and center in this world has magnified a lot of deficiencies, specifically as it relates to pedagogy. Whew, that was a long way roundabout answer to a very simple question that you asked me, Andy. I'm sorry. This is what happens.
That's okay.
I start to geek out about this stuff, Andy, and this is what happens. I'm sorry.
Hey man, nobody's here to hear me talk. Nobody's listening to hear me talk. I'd rather hear you, Weston, trust me. But you know what? I think you bring up a really good point, and especially in the pandemic, I think we saw a lot of school districts in Ohio throw tech at kids this past spring and look at the teaching staff and just say, okay, here you go. We've equipped them. But one of the things that I think we're really kind of getting away from is really equipping our teachers. Like professional development time is dropping in districts. We're more focused on number of hours in the classroom versus number of hours developing instructional pedagogy and really talking about, what works. And so we're kind of in that quasi shift where the superintendents are in love with the tech, And they want to put that out to the community, like, look how many devices we have. But it doesn't always, mean it's the best instruction, because our teachers need to have time to work those kinks out. Like, you think about your first few years teaching, I compare it to your first few years teaching. How many units did you throw out your first few years teaching? Like, the majority of them. You'd walk in, and you give an example in Bold School, with all your little props and stuff like that. You walk in with a lesson that you think in your mind is going to be amazing, and then it falls flat on its face, or it takes a while to work out. Like I always used to tell my kids in 12th period, like, you guys are getting the varsity 12th period. First period, they got the junior high. Like, that was not the good look of my lesson. But by the time we get to the end of the day and I've worked out the king, and I've seen what you adapt to and what you don't, it's really good now. But how do I think we try to do that, and we try to find ways to really dig into the importance of instructional pedagogy, but we don't really give our teachers a chance to do that, do we?
No, too often we do. We roll out, and I use this example all the time, we roll out technology, and then we just like, all right, teachers, like, you'll figure it out. Like, think about MRI technology, you guys. Like, nobody just rolled an MRI machine into a hospital and was like, yeah, doctors are going to figure this out. But this is how, I'll tell you what, you want to know how my first interactive whiteboard showed up in my classroom? I walked in on a Tuesday and it was hanging on the wall. And that was the extent of training I got around my interactive whiteboard, right? The thing we all put on the walls, and we're just like, oh, this is the next thing, right? And what you're talking about is a fundamental problem in how we approach not just technology, but professional development in our schools. Like, and PD and coaching is always the first thing on the chopping block. It's always the first thing on the chopping block, because it's intangible, right? And so let's acknowledge a couple things. Number one, it's intangible. It's difficult to measure. To your point, you can't say, like, I have this many devices. So it's the first thing on the chopping block for that reason. And let's acknowledge a painful truth that people in my field need to acknowledge. It's the first thing on the chopping block because all too often it is entirely unhelpful. There is too much professional development going on out there that is entirely unhelpful. And folks who are out there offering PD, I wish they would go do something else, right? Go do something else, because our PD has to be really meaningful. Because here's what we know to be true. Like, professional development is important. There are two different studies that were done. One was done in 1983, and then this study was replicated again in 2007. And it showed that when skills are simply shown to a teacher, right, on like TeacherTube or during a keynote or something, what we know to be true is that only about 10% of teachers are going to be able to replicate those skills. 10% just by seeing. But, and this is the exact verbiage of the study, what they discovered was when teachers are coached through the awkward phase of implementation, more than 95% can replicate the skill. 95%. Coaching can't be the thing we think about doing. It has to be the thing that we are always doing. It's why I'm such a stickler for mentorship and coaching and relationships. Like, those things matter. And so we can't just continue to roll out devices and hope things are sticky and hope practices change. Like, it's professional development. It is coaching, and it's longitudinal, not drive-by, spray and pray and hope that things are going to turn out well. Like, it's things like you gotta stick and stay and make it pay. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to PD and the coaching work that needs to happen with teachers on a regular basis. We throw too many of our teachers into the deep end of the swimming pool and hope they just survive. And the ones who survive, you'll find over and over again, found mentorship along the way. The ones who don't, the ones who leave us within that 5-year time period when we experience so much teacher attrition, it's because they don't have that mentoring and those relationships. They just don't.
Right. And we talk about differentiation all the time. We talk to our teachers, like, we need to differentiate for the kids. You have multiple levels of learners. You have this, you have that. But then in professional development, do we ever differentiate for our staffs? Do we ever differentiate for our teachers, or dig down into what they really want to do, or what they want to know, or what they do know? You know what I mean? We don't all the good habits of good teaching. We don't do when we provide them professional development. So in reality, in a lot of ways, sometimes we set them up for failure, right?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And then too much of the professional development we give teachers too. Like, let's just acknowledge that great PD is two things. Great PD is a warm bath and a cold shower, right? That's what great PD is, right? It's combination, equal parts warm bath and cold shower. Equal parts innovation and validation. And I'll tell you what, it was a thing I always struggled with as a participant in professional development, is somebody would come in during a PD and they wanted to tell me everything I was doing wrong, everything I wasn't working. And the fact of the matter is that is an incomplete message. There have been great things happening in our schools for a really long time. we are graduating more kids and teaching more kids from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds with greater rigor and greater success than ever before in our nation's history, and nobody knows it, not even us. And so when we think about what great PD needs to look like, there needs to be space for two things: innovation and validation. We have to validate the great things that are happening in teachers' classrooms right now, and then we have to pursue innovation, but within its lane. Like we can't overreach in terms of what we're trying to fix about our schools, because if we try to throw out the baby with the bathwater, that's never going to be the cure for what ails us.
Right. And you know what? And that's what I loved. And I've shared your book, Bold School, with our staff. It was one of our book study books. And myth 1 and myth 2, education is broken and the old way of teaching no longer works. You know, when you said earlier, we need to amplify our teachers' voices, our educators' voices. Like, I immediately thought of those two myths, because you're right. I feel like, you know, and maybe it's shifting a little bit in this pandemic where people have had to have their kids at home and they've had to educate them themselves. But, you know, there was this idea that education was broken, that we're not doing things the right way. We're still caught up with what they're doing in China or Finland or another country, that it's almost like we do what we tell our kids not to do. We always tell our kids, appreciate what you have, not what you don't. But in America with teachers, we don't appreciate what we have. We just keep like lusting for what we don't have.
Yeah. And forgive me, because I'll probably talk about this during the keynote a little bit as well. You mentioned, you know, I say all the, like, education is not broken. It's not. It's just not. And I'll talk about why during the keynote a little bit. But I'll tell you this, everyone, like, when we talk about great systems of public education around the world, we don't talk about our own, do we? No, we always talk about, like, what's going on in Finland, what's going on in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and all these Scandinavian countries are popping up a lot right now as sort of like the benchmarks for great work in education. Quick show of hands, anyone done any longitudinal education work in Scandinavia? Anyone? I have. Let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about it for just a second. Let's take a country like Finland. Everyone wants to talk about Finland right now. Everyone. Oh, the Finns are crushing it. There's a guy who wrote a book out there. It's called The Smartest Kids on the Planet. And I'll tell you what, low key on this call, if this author and I ever meet, we are going to fight. How dare you? And he's the smartest kids on the planet. And it's all about kids from Finland and their education system. Here's what the Finns are awesome at. I'll give them credit for this. You know what the Finns are awesome at? Educating almost all of their children moderately well. They crush it in that space. But like, as a parent, like, I'm not content to have my children educated moderately well. I want them educated exceptionally well. Guys, name a Finnish entrepreneur. Name a Finnish billionaire. Name anyone from Finland. They don't exactly kill it in the creativity and innovation space. Okay. Furthermore, let's talk about Finland. You know what the Finns do? You want to talk about high stakes testing? Nobody does it more high stakes than the Finns. They do this in Finland. They do this in Denmark. They do it in Norway, and they do it in Sweden. You know what every single one of their kids do in about 6th grade? They take a test. And that test in about 6th grade will determine whether they are tracked into a blue collar track where they learn a trade, or a white collar academic track where they are then allowed to go to college. And then guess who they measure after 6th grade? Only their kids who are on the white collar academic track. And those are the numbers they stack against ours. Guys, that's not apples to oranges as a comparison. That is apples to cars. Okay, so we have to take a long, hard look about what and who we are comparing ourselves. Furthermore, anyone ever been to Scandinavia? I'll tell you what, like, I remember being on a train in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I'm holding onto this handle and I'm looking up at all these giant Viking people. And I'll tell you this, I have never felt shorter or more tan in my whole damn life. Guys, almost all of their kids in Scandinavia come from nearly identical socioeconomic backgrounds. That true for the kids that we serve? No, of course it's not. And so let's take a good hard look at what we're measuring, who we're measuring against, and let's consider that we're not measuring apples to oranges. And when we take a look at our education system, recognize we are educating more children with greater rigor from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds than ever before in our nation's history, and nobody knows it. I am insulted by these people who say that education is broken. It is insulting to practitioners who are in classrooms right now as we speak, doing amazing things on behalf of kids, and it's insulting to our predecessors, the teachers who came before us, many of whom are responsible for us having the skills that we have right now. Education is not broken. And we have to stop letting people who don't know our profession tell us about it as though they know. They don't. Oh, Andy, get me off this soapbox, brother.
No, I think that's important, man. I think that's important for teachers to hear. I think it's important for all of our educators to hear, because, you know, we're really in a time where we, I think, are really underappreciated. And I don't think that's an Ohio thing. I think that's an around the nation thing. And I think that we hear a lot about what teachers could be doing better in the classrooms when that's not really the case, you know? And like I said, I was really hopeful in the spring that the pandemic would kind of open some people's eyes to this idea of glorified babysitting. And I heard it on your podcast, on the Teaching Keating podcast, when you guys talked about the babysitter hours, you know what I mean? The rate per hour.
Give us that rate. I'll take that rate.
Right? $10 a kid in Ohio for 25 kids for 6.5 hours a day. You know, we'll all sign up for that job.
Heck yeah.
But, you know, I think that's an important message, and that's why I'm kind of glad that you went there with it, because I think it's important for our people in Ohio to hear too that they are doing good stuff, that what they're doing is not broken. They're leading the right way, they're teaching the right way, they're being innovative and creative, and they need to hear that more. And that's one of the things as an organization that we really try to do and focus on.
Well, I appreciate that you're walking that line between innovation and validation, because our educators, it's not just in Ohio, educators around the country need to hear it right now. It's a thankless job day to day as is. And the thanks that educators get right now needs to not be empty thanks. It needs to be authentic acknowledgement that, hey, like this notion that we had that education is or was broken is completely false.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, because we've only got about 20 minutes left, I kind of want to shift from the instructional pedagogy and things like that a little bit to relationships, because I think that's really important. And I loved Breaking Bold because I felt like it kind of focused on something. And, you know, I'll be transparent here. I don't know that when I started teaching, or actually I'll tell you, when I started teaching, I was not a very good teacher. Like fundamentally, I didn't know a lot of instructional strategies. You know, we didn't have a ton of resources in the district that I worked in, and it's a great district. It's actually a district I moved my kids into, and my family lives there now, but we didn't have a ton of resources. I had a terrible pre-service experience, which I think I told you about with my mentor teacher going through some personal stuff. So I've kind of was just out on an island. And in addition to that, I was a halftime athletic director too. So I'm balancing being an athletic director and a first year teacher. And one of the things that I can recognize now is that because I prioritized relationships, I probably was a lot more successful with kids than I would have been had I been poor at relationships and been poor at teaching, you know. And the relationship piece really got me to get kids on the track I needed them going. But talk to us a little bit about relationships, because you guys share so much in the book about relationships. But, you know, chapter 1, just boldly breaking towards relationships, because it's all about like location. It's relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do a quick experiment. Everyone get your typing fingers ready again. I'm curious to hear from you. Think about the most influential teacher you've ever had. Bring yourself all the way back there, right? I want you to, there's this wonderful sort of immortality that comes with education and with teaching when it's done really, really well. Because right now I'm asking you to think about the most influential teacher you've ever had. And all of a sudden a person, or hopefully a couple people's names, are rushing to your head right now. And you haven't seen these people potentially in years, decades. So number 1, think about the name of the most influential teacher you've ever had. Number 2, think about a quick sentence, like, why were they so influential? Type it into the chat, please. Number 1, the name of your most influential teacher. And number 2, why they were so influential, right? Call these people out by name. Lindsay. Who is this? Yeah, Doc McKay. Thank you, Lindsay. Always greeted me, asked me about my day. Mr. Koopman, Ryan Spriggs. Yeah, John Mercer. He believed in me. Funny. Good. Andrew, tell me why Cindy was great. Good. Yeah, Mrs. Vargas.
It was awesome.
Yeah, Mrs. Vargas. Incredibly creative way to teach English. Good. Cared about me, believed in me, made me feel important, cared about me personally, right? Look at what everyone's writing. It doesn't matter where I ask this question. right? Understand very clearly. It doesn't matter if I ask this question in Cleveland, Ohio, in Littleton, Colorado, in East Los Angeles, in Copenhagen, Denmark, or in Caracas, Venezuela. It does not matter. Anytime I ask this question, you know what I never hear? You know what nobody has ever said to me? Man, I'll tell you what, like Mr. Roberts could work a graphic organizer like nobody's business. You know what I don't hear? I never hear like, man, you know what? Like Mrs. Bennett's Socratic seminar game was bananas. You never hear about strategies and you never hear about tools, which are the things as educators we talk about all the time. You know what you hear about? You always hear about relationships. You always hear about the habituated behaviors of educators who are masters at relationships. You hear about things like belief. You hear about things like compassion. You hear about things like trust. You hear about things like motivation. These are things that we hear about again and again and again. And so I was really curious when I wrote Breaking Bold, like we talk about relationships all the time in education, but we do so with this sort of like frustrating vagueness and ambiguity. I'll tell you this. I asked a room of 5,000 educators at one point. I'm in a room, I'm on the stage, and I said like, hey, give me some feedback. I asked two questions. I said, what does it mean to build great relationships with kids, and how do we do it? And I got a variety of different answers, as you can imagine, in a room of 5,000 people, many of which were super vague and entirely unhelpful. You know what the answer that I got more than any other was? The answer to the question of what does it mean to build great relationships with kids, and how do we do it? The answer that I got more than any other was people who just wrote back, relationships, relationships, relationships. And I'm sorry, I couldn't help but think like, what the hell does that even mean? Like that's like asking somebody, what does it take to be a great teacher? And somebody looks you dead in the eye and they say, teach, teach, teach. Like we talk about relationships in this way that's really frustrating because it's really ambiguous and it's entirely unhelpful. And so in Breaking Bold, I was curious to know, like I looked at Marzano's work, I looked at John Hattie's work, I looked at George Kuros's work, I looked at everyone inside and outside of education. I even looked at like Brene Brown's work and some of the work that she's been doing around vulnerability, because everyone's talking about relationships. I poured over hundreds, and I mean hundreds of research studies about relationships. And you know what I found? People who are masterful at the art of relationships, they adopt any number of 12 very specific habits, ranging from the understanding of perception to belief in kids to compassion to trust. And they make sure these habits show up day after day after day. You know what's interesting? Every single one of you who wrote something here in the chat window wrote something that's related to one of these 12 habits. Every single one of you. And so the challenge for us is, let's talk about relationships in a way that's specific. Let's do so in a way that's helpful. And let's distill what we mean when we're talking about relationships so that we can replicate those things. Because I'll tell you what, everyone's talking about achievement gaps right now and equity gaps right now. You know the way we close the achievement gap, right? The way we close the achievement gap is not by giving kids more standards or more content or more stuff. Right? The way we close the achievement gap is by making sure that every child has a meaningful relationship with an adult who believes and cares about them and believes with relentless tenacity in their ability to succeed. That's the way. Like that's the secret sauce. Every single kid needs that person. And we can create that. We can cultivate that. And the beauty is it costs us nothing, and it means the world to children. We don't have to invest in new technologies. We don't have to invest in new infrastructure. These are habituated behaviors. You want to talk about what it means to be bold school, right? Remember that bold is just a mashup in my terminology of the words blended and old, as a constant reminder that as we pursue blended learning and blended and online lesson design, we have to make sure our old school wisdom comes with us. And the greatest old school wisdom that any educator can bring to the table is the old school wisdom that comes with building relationships.
You know what? And that's, you're so right. And one of the things that I think was most important or impacted me the most when I was reading Breaking Bold was vulnerability. You know, and you guys talk about that a little bit. That's one of the 12 habits that you were just kind of mentioning. You know, I think sometimes as educators, it's so scary to be vulnerable. You know, and we're not talking about oversharing. Some oversharing is not vulnerability. Oversharing, you know, that is where you go down the rabbit hole to get fired. Vulnerability, like allowing kids to know that you're not perfect, letting kids know that they can take risks, embracing uncertainty, things like that. I mean, how important is that when you're trying to build that relationship that you're then going to use, in all honesty, to leverage the student to get to do what you're trying to get them to do, to kind of push through that wall. Just can you talk a little bit about vulnerability and just kind of how it is?
I would love to. Vulnerability. First of all, show of hands real quick. Anyone seen Brene Brown's special on Netflix, Daring Greatly? Yeah, Jay, you've seen it. Yeah, Lindsay, you've seen it. Back me up here. Good, Cammy's seen it as well. Back me up here, you guys. Like, worth the watch. Yes, it's worth the hour.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good, Jay. Thank you for chiming in. Like, that's your homework for tonight. If you haven't seen it, take the hour on Netflix. Go watch it. Watch it with your spouse, your significant other, whoever it is. Like, it's worth the time. So Brene Brown defines vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. That's how Brene Brown defines vulnerability. And if we take a look at vulnerability through that lens, we have to understand that we ask kids to enter into that fray every time they walk through the door, whether the classroom is virtual, whether it is hybrid, or whether it is a traditional face-to-face classroom. We ask them to enter into the arena of vulnerability every time they walk through the door. And the fact of the matter is, too often we don't have conversations about the vulnerability it takes to be a learner. If you don't think it takes vulnerability to be a learner, go learn a new tech tool. Go crack John Hattie's book if you've never read it before. Like, you'll learn really quickly. Like, it takes a lot of vulnerability to enter into a place with the understanding that you don't know. You are a beginner. And we ask kids to do that every single day, but we so rarely have conversations with them about what it takes and the courage it takes to be vulnerable, to engage in the place where uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure are part of our day-to-day. Matt, the Netflix show, it's Brene Brown's special. It's called Daring Greatly on Netflix. Entirely worth the watch. Vulnerability is one of those 12 habits. It's one of those habits that educators who are, you're welcome, Matt, masters at the art of building relationship, they understand exists in schools and in the classroom, and then they have authentic conversation with kids about that vulnerability, uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure that they're asking them to enter into, so that kids can recognize, like, hey, that feeling that I'm feeling is normal, right? The difference between kids who are successful and kids who are unsuccessful is they're able to overcome that level of vulnerability and admit that it's okay not to know a thing. Look at all the kids that you have, especially at the middle school level, who have so much promise. They have so much talent. They're so bright. How many parent-teacher conferences have you had with parents where you're just like, this kid is like, your kid is so bright, they just don't apply themselves. You know why they don't? It's the vulnerability piece, right? They are reluctant to be vulnerable. Why? Because that is a place that is just absolutely ravaged with uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And if they enter into that fray, if they enter into that arena, guess what lives on the other side? Failure. Failure always lives on the other side of the learning process. And they don't want to experience the vulnerability that comes with failure. And we just have to help them work through that moment. But we can't if we can't even label the emotion that they're feeling.
Right. And sometimes we create that environment unintentionally when we don't use formative assessment enough, and we're constantly grading every time students do work, and I think that one of the places that really leads me to is another one of the habit 6 is belief in students, and I think that sometimes it's so hard when I look at my teachers and they have 126 to 140 students in a school year, you know what I mean? And building those individual relationships, but belief in students, Weston, like how can you kind of summarize that for our people here in Ohio, the importance of it, and explaining it to students?
Yeah. So first of all, when you look at belief in students as it relates to John Hattie's work, there's almost nothing that we can do that has a greater effect and a greater impact on student learning and student achievement than belief in kids. Its effect size is greater than 1.2. What does that mean? It means when implemented with fidelity, when belief is authentic, kids can grow more than 3 academic years over a single year's worth of time. Now, let's take a look at the why. What does the research tell us about belief in kids? Belief in kids is so powerful, not because it changes a child's behavior, but because it changes ours. Believing in kids is not super impactful because it changes children's behaviors, but because our behaviors change. Why? Because what researchers have discovered, when teachers authentically believe that every child can achieve at a high level, you know what they do? They ask more rigorous questions. They offered up more opportunities for failure and for kids to retry and reattempt and reattempt. You know why? It's because like even in a traditional face-to-face classroom, when we believe in kids, our proximity to those kids who we authentically believe can succeed, we have greater proximity to those kids. We gravitate towards those kids more frequently. We offer longer wait times to those rigorous questions that we've asked. And so belief is really, really important because it significantly alters an educator's behavior. And when we don't authentically believe that our kids can achieve at a high level, many of those things start to go away. And then all of a sudden, guess what happens? Kids don't achieve at a high level. And then it's this weird sort of cyclical self-fulfilling prophecy. Belief in kids is fundamentally important. Like we have to believe it and we have to live it and we have to walk it day after day after day because it changes our behavior so dramatically.
You know, and I'm glad you tied it back into Hattie, because again, it's just another example of some of the information we can find when we go looking for these things. That, you know, you're not really going to John Hattie to look for how can my relationships help kids, but that you're going to find it there. You know, and it's why we got to dig into that stuff, and it's why we got to explore, you know, the different research that's out there.
Yeah, Andy, too often too, we go to John Hattie's work and the real easy thing to do when you go to look at John Hattie's work and all those 256 influences is you look for things that reinforce your own belief systems, right? So you're going to look at John Hattie's list and you're going to see that homework has an effect size of like 2/10. And you're going to say, see, I told you, right? Homework, garbage. Like, okay, like that our chat, like, are you going to look at summer vacation? You're going to be like, oh man, summer vacation actually moves kids backwards in terms of the learning progression. And then you're going to get real nervous, like, oh, don't take that from me, man. Like, I need my summer vacation. Like, well, anyone who's taught more than 4 seconds knows why we need summer vacation. So like the temptation is to go look at those things when you look at John Hattie's work and look for the things that feed your pre-existing notions, or look for the things and try to combat the ones that maybe don't align with your belief systems. The challenge for us is to move past that and look at like, okay, what can actually help kids? If self-assessment has an effect size of 1.44, okay, how can I make that show up more frequently? We've got to be able to be non-emotive about looking at John Hattie's work, because what invariably happens is we look at that work, we look at things that feed pre-existing notions that we have, and we rely on looking and talking about those. And that doesn't do anything for us, nor does it do anything for kids.
Right. And you know what? And it's so important, especially right now. And, you know, one of the things that I think when people start digging into your work a little bit, and you put it on the back cover of Breaking Bold, but are the kids okay? And you kind of talked about it earlier with our teachers. Our teachers are drowning right now. You know, it's so important for us to focus on the human aspect of what we do as administrators, as teachers who have, you know, great relationships with other staff members in the building, not forgetting our cleaning crews or our outside custodial workers or anything like that. And especially not forgetting the kids, right? The teacher, one of my favorite podcasts that you've done recently is the Alone one. And you talked about how it's just not human nature to be alone, but all of us, some of us here in Ohio have not been back to school yet, you know, and, you know, specifically in our district, even though we offered school, we have some kids online who haven't been out of their house, like legitimately, except to maybe grandma's house since March. And you know, this relationship piece is so important. And so just talk a little bit, because I know we're going to get up against it here. Talk a little bit about just checking in on each other, educator to educator, educator to kid. How do we do that? How do we make sure we're taking care of each other?
Yeah, people need people. People need people. And I posted this the other day. Like, I say this as a huge advocate for instructional technology, for technology as a whole. Like, I love technology. I think it's amazing. And at the same time, like, I think if we've learned anything during this time, you know, virtual learning is the thing that we're doing right now as a matter of necessity. But I think if there's anything the global pandemic has taught us, it's that people need people. We need each other. Look at the rates of everything right now. Look at the rates of alcoholism. Look at the rates of depression. Look at the rates of suicide. Like, everything is up. Everything is up. and it's up in a way that's huge and disturbing. And when you look at it, it is a byproduct of isolation. Harvard University did the longest ever, most longitudinal study on the science of happiness. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it. They did the longest study ever on the science of happiness. And you know what determines more than fame, more than wealth, more than any other variable, whether a person is happy over the course of a lifetime? It's the quality of their relationships. And you know what they discovered about loneliness? Loneliness kills, right? More than alcoholism, more than smoking, right? Loneliness has a negative impact on physical health and wellness. And so we have to acknowledge that a lot of our kids are up against it right now in terms of loneliness. We have to acknowledge that a lot of us right now are feeling lonely and isolated and like we're out on an island. And this is a thing that I keep telling teachers right now, and I keep telling school administrators and district administrators, please, please, please hear me when I tell you this. For anyone on the call who needs to hear it right now, do not light yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm right now, please, right? There's nothing in that for you. There's nothing in that on the back end for any of the kids that we're trying to serve. There's one thing that keeps me up at night right now, and it is the tidal wave of teacher resignations that are coming down the pipeline. The canary in the coal mine is substitutes, right? Try to find a substitute right now. Good luck, right? That's the canary in the coal mine. Teacher shortages, massive teacher shortages are not far behind. And so we have to do a good job of taking care of each other. And we have to do a good job of reminding each other every day, don't light yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. Why? Because our kids are going to need us now more than ever, and they need all of us. They need every last one of us. We are not replacing master teachers at a fast enough rate to be able to lose the great teachers we have, because we are either putting so much pressure on ourselves or so much pressure on each other that the job becomes unsustainable. So hear me when I tell you, you got to strike a good balance. You got to find those boundaries where they live. There will always be more. There will always be more. And the fact of the matter is, at some point, you got to shut it down. You got to take care of yourself, take care of your own families. You can't fill from an empty vessel. It's simple. It's the law of source and resource, right? You feed the source, you become the resource. And the fact of the matter is, all of you are a source right now. And you need to feed the source, feed the source, feed the source, so that you can be a resource for others.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. And I think that's a really good place to end our time. Weston, one of the questions I have to ask you before we go is, you're right there, old school, and then all of a sudden there's this influx of technology in schools, and now we're all having to learn blended learning. Then we end up going online. Then you write a book called Breaking Bold, and COVID is even worse. It's almost like, it's almost like you've got a crystal ball here for big things in education. Are you working on another book, or what's next?
No, brother, I'm not. I don't want the. I'm not sure if it's if I'm manifesting all of this, but if so, I'm gonna stop writing for a while. Andy, I lucked out, man. I completely lucked out. I happened to, at the exact right time, write a book on blended and online learning and about building relationships in future-focused classrooms. And then, everything happened. I am either the luckiest or unluckiest person on planet Earth, depending on who you ask. But yeah, no, I'm going to stop writing for a little bit. I'm going to listen more to what other people are saying. Lindsay, thanks so much for writing into the chat, reminding us. Yeah, Brene Brown's got an excellent podcast on Spotify. Listen to that. No, I'm going to tune into other people for a little bit. I'm going to stop writing. I say that. I'm sure I'll write something else here, because I'll get a what is it, a bee in my bonnet or a burr in the saddle or whatever the saying is, and I'll start writing something again. But for right now, no, right now all I'm trying to be is a resource for other people, because right now I need to not have my nose in my computer. I need to have my nose in schools and in classrooms and be supporting educators in any way that I can. It's what we all need to be doing.
And who do you go to? And I don't want you to throw out Kieschnick just so he can get some more followers, but when I think Twitter is a great resource that we may be underused in education to find great ideas or anything, but real fast is, who do you go to on Twitter?
Yeah. So Tom Murray is one of my go-tos on Twitter. He's incredible. Jimmy Casas does incredible work along with Joe Sanfilippo. Those guys are amazing. I love Alice Keeler. If you're looking for real practical tips for using technology, Alice Keeler is really, really wonderful. Jen, who runs the Cult of Pedagogy page, is remarkable. Her stuff is amazing. Yeah, those are some of my go-tos right now. Vanola Mason is an up-and-comer who's doing some really cool work around equity. Dr. Tyrone Howard does amazing work around equity as well. So those are a handful of my my peeps who are kind of go-tos for me when I need inspiration and thoughts and words of wisdom.
Well, I tell you what, man, we really appreciate the time today. I hope you're going to get out to Ohio soon. We're looking forward to having you out in March and being super flexible and working with us and making this work. You know, I'm a huge fan. I think your work is incredible, and I think it's really important for educators right now. And I think everybody who's on the call today, and you know, the people who see the video, the rest of our membership, I think they're going to be really disappointed that they kind of missed out, because you know, I thought this was a great hour. I thought it flew by me, and we can't thank you enough from OMLA, taking the time to reach out to people in Ohio and making this work.
Well, Andy, I appreciate you. I appreciate you all for being on the call and for sticking with us. I appreciate you too, just kind of letting us make it sort of like this comedians in cars getting coffee kind of vibe, right? Where instead of just being a presentation, we could just have authentic conversations. So I appreciate that, you guys. I appreciate you all. And hey, if you haven't heard it today, forget me as a fellow educator for just a moment. Hear me as a parent, from a parent, because I don't think you hear it often enough from parents right now. And I'm sure you're hearing from parents all the time, but I'll be damned if you spend an hour with this parent and you don't hear it from me. Thank you, right? For my number one most favorite role as dad. Thank you from a parent for everything. All you do, all you have done, all you endeavor to do on behalf of our kids. Know that I'm so grateful. Thank you guys so much. And even as a parent, I want to reiterate, don't light yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. We'll all be fine.
All right. Thanks, Weston. And we can find you. You always end your podcast with, where can we find you?
Yes.
With you and Mom.
Find me on Twitter at Wes_Kieschnick. Find me on Facebook, on Instagram, or find me at WestonKieschnick.com, my new website, or find us at the podcast, which is Teaching Keating.
Right. We threw all of that into the chat. So if anybody needs those into the chat, thanks to John Pato for moderating the chat and getting some things out there. I think he even put the link to Brene Brown's Netflix clip in there. And thank you, Weston. Really looking forward to March 4th, man. And there's not a lot around Kalahari, bro. So we could do a cars in coffee or whatever, do some little film a little something really quick out there, because there's nothing but country roads, man. You're used to that, right?
I'm in. Well, remind me of home. I was born and raised in Eastern Iowa. Come on, baby. Let's go country roads. As long as they're all gravel, I'm in.
Yeah, we're not going to hold that pumpkin against you, the Hawkeye pumpkin. You know, when you come out here to Buckeye country, we'll.
My Hawkeye pumpkin was incredible, and I will defend my Hawkeye pride, my University of Iowa pride. I know where I am when I'm coming to Ohio. I know I'm in Buckeye country, but you know what? I'll stand strong. I'll weather the storm, as the Hawkeyes have been weathering many a storm this football season.
Yep. Well, hey, thanks for the time. Thanks to everybody who joined the Zoom today. We really appreciate you guys, all the members of OMLA. Don't forget, we've got a lot of upcoming great events. We've got Jack Berkmeyer, which should be really interesting. He's always a great time. And then Swanson, the teaming Zoom with Swanson. If you have not seen their stuff or seen what they do, they are incredible. Like I'm telling you, they are incredible. So you want to get in part of that, especially if you're at a middle school that teams. Weston, again, thank you, OMLA board members who are on, and members. And if you're not a member, there's also some links we'll throw into the chat that you can join. But really appreciate everybody for joining us today. Thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks, Weston.
Thanks, everybody. Be well. We'll see you in March.
Just a real quick update. Everyone will be receiving a link later today with this recording, plus information on how to receive a certificate of attendance from OMLA, so you can submit that to your local professional development committee. We do have some, as Andy mentioned, we have some great upcoming PD opportunities. We have a sip and tea with Jack Berkmeyer on November 17th. We have the OMLA Team of the Year, as Andy said, Swanton Middle School. And then we have just added January 12th, 2021 with Kevin Honeycutt. So Kevin will also be a keynote speaker at our March 4th and 5th conference. in the link that gets sent out right after this meeting ends, you're going to be able to register for each of those upcoming PD opportunities. So on behalf of OMLA, thank you to Andy for being a great moderator today, and Weston for sharing your time with us, and we'll see everybody later.
Thanks, John.